Chapter 22. That was another of my frightening fantasies. Staring out my kitchen window at the woodpile, I imagined the whole scene with Mr. Northwood. If only it were true, I thought. If only I didn't have to shoot him. It was Thursday afternoon, and I had stayed home from school. My stomach was upset. I felt really shaky and strange. I was a nervous wreck. The alarm had gone off at 7, the usual time. I had started to get dressed, and then realized I couldn't face another day at school. Another day of kids staring at me, wishing me good luck, asking me when I was going to shoot him. At first, I had loved all the attention, but now it frightened me. After my mom went off to work, I climbed back into bed. I was shaking all over. I couldn't get rid of my chills. Finally, I fell back to sleep and didn't wake up until noon. I kept getting painful stomach aches, and I felt like I had to puke. I forced down some buttered toast and a Coke for lunch, but then my stomach felt even worse. Maybe I'm sick, I thought. Maybe I really do have the flu. But I knew I was just scared to death about killing Mr. Northwood. Once he's dead, I'll feel so much better. That's what I told myself. Strange way to cheer oneself up, huh? I should have worked on my research project, but I knew I couldn't concentrate. I didn't waste a day, though. I found a good hiding place for the pistol. There is a loose stone in the basement wall behind the dryer. After I shoot Mr. Northwood, I'll pull the stone out and slip the gun into the hole. The gun will fit snugly behind the stone, and no one will ever find it. Finding that hiding place made me feel a little better, but just a little bit. Dennis called me at 3:30. He saw that I wasn't in school and wondered if I was okay. I thought it was sweet of him to call. He's really starting to care about me, I thought. We've collected nearly $1,200, he told me, lowering his voice to a whisper. I could picture his green eyes sparkling with excitement. Wow, was all I managed to reply. I mean, it was impressive. That's a lot of money. Half of it is yours, if... Shh, I cut him off. I don't care about the money, I really don't. But you're still doing it, right? Dennis asked. I caught a little worry in his voice. Yeah, sure, I replied reluctantly. Saturday, Dennis repeated. Saturday. I didn't want him to hang up. I wanted to talk longer. I wanted to tell him that he was dumping Caitlin, that he was interested only in me now. I wanted him to tell me how brave I was, how much I was helping him, how much fun we were going to have together once Mr. Northwood was dead. But Dennis muttered goodbye, and the dial tone buzzed in my ear. As I replaced the receiver, Dennis's low voice echoed in my ear. Saturday, Saturday, Saturday. I heard sounds in the backyard. Making my way to the kitchen window, I saw Mr. Northwood, home from school, in his red and black flannel jacket and wool ski cap, bending over to pick up logs from his woodpile. That's when I had the evil fantasy of pushing the logs onto him and bashing in his skull, and making it look like a terrible accident. My daydream ended. Mr. Northwood was still standing there in the middle of his backyard, and as I stared at him, bundling 2 logs in his arms and starting to the house with them, I realized I was shaking all over. I can't take this, I cried aloud. I knew that I'd never make it to Saturday. Never. My heart pounding, I walked quickly to the desk in the living room to get the gun. I untaped the key my mother hid under the desk and slid it into the keyhole. I'm going to do it now, I decided. Chapter 23. My hand was trembling as I pulled open the drawer and reached for the gun, but I stopped shaking as soon as my hand wrapped around the pistol. Something about how solid it was made me feel calmer. It felt so warm in my cold, clammy hand, warm and almost comforting. I dragged my coat out of the front closet and pulled it on. Then I slipped the gun into a coat pocket. I'm going to feel so much better in just a few moments, I told myself. I peered out through the window in the kitchen door. Mr. Northwood was bending over in front of the woodpile, arranging logs, his back to me. I opened the kitchen door and stepped out onto the back stoop. I had my right hand inside the coat pocket, wrapped tightly around the pistol. I'm going to feel so much better. It was a bone-chillingly cold day, but I couldn't feel it. I didn't feel anything except the pistol in my hand. I didn't see anything except Mr. Northwood bent over his logs. I made my way across my backyard, stepping carefully over the frozen ground, being careful not to make a sound. How close do I need to get, I asked myself, staring hard at Mr. Northwood's red and black wool back. How close? How close? Close enough not to miss. I stopped short when he stood up. Was he going to turn around and see me? Was he going to spoil this for me? He stretched, pushing his long arms straight up over his head. Then he bent again and began lifting logs onto a low stack. I pulled a gun from my coat pocket. I was squeezing it so tightly my hand hurt. I pulled back the hammer. It made a metallic click. I sucked in my breath. I sucked in my breath, afraid Mr. Northwood had heard it. He let out a groan as he dropped some logs onto the stack he was building. I took another step toward him, tiptoeing on the frozen grass. Another step. How close do I have to get? How close? Another step. Another. I raised the gun, aimed it at his back. Am I really going to do this? I suddenly wondered. Am I really crossing the backyard with a loaded pistol in my hand? Am I really going to shoot Mr. Northwood? Or is this another one of my violent fantasies? No, this was no fantasy. This was real. Cold and real. I aimed for his back, slid my finger over the trigger, and prepared to shoot. Chapter 24. Joanna! I gasped as I heard a girl shout my name. Mr. Northwood heard her too. He spun around, startled. Had he seen the gun before I jammed it back into my coat pocket? Joanna, I didn't hear you, he cried, his blue eyes wide with surprise. I came to ask you about the homework, I stammered, thinking quickly. I turned to see who had called out my name. Margaret! She was standing in the driveway, her bulging backpack slung over the shoulder of her coat. What are you doing here? I demanded. There's going to be a quiz tomorrow, she replied, making her way across the grass. You weren't there. I thought maybe you'd need the notes. What a considerate friend, Mr. Northwood commented. Where were you today, Joanna? We missed you. I didn't feel well, I told him. He tisk-tissed and returned to his logs. Margaret and I began heading back toward my house. I have a tape recording of the class, if you'd like to hear what you missed, Mr. Northwood called to me. I thanked him, but said I'd borrow Margaret's notes instead. Do you want to come in? I asked Margaret. I was studying her face, trying to figure out why she had come. She and I hadn't been friendly for weeks. I knew she hadn't come to deliver the history notes. No, I have only a minute, she replied. She brushed a ringlet of red hair off her forehead. The afternoon sun lowered behind the trees. A shadow rolled over both of us. The air grew colder. Everyone's talking about you, Joanna, Margaret whispered, gazing over my shoulder to Mr. Northwood. Everyone's talking about the dare, and about all the money that kids are betting. Yeah, well, what was I supposed to say? I had a sudden impulse to explain it all to Margaret. I really wanted to tell her how Mr. Northwood was ruining Dennis's life, and how he was picking only on Dennis's friends, and how he was ruining my life, too. But I knew Margaret wouldn't understand about Dennis and me. She would never understand about the dare, or about Dennis and me and the kids in our group, because Margaret wasn't one of us. She wouldn't get it. She just wouldn't. So I fought back the impulse to explain and just returned her stare. So what do you want? I asked sharply. She hesitated, chewing her lower lip. Well, I just had to ask you, she said, her voice nearly a whisper. I mean, you're not really going to go through with it, are you? No, of course not, I told her, squeezing the gun tightly inside my coat pocket. Of course not. Chapter 25. Saturday arrived gray and blustery. A perfect day for a murder, I thought, staring down at the bare maple trees from my bedroom window. I stayed in bed until I heard the car door slam and heard Mom drive off to work. Then I quickly got cleaned up and dressed, pulling on gray sweats. I brushed and brushed my hair until my scalp hurt. I think I needed some pain to wake me up. It was nearly lunchtime, but I couldn't eat. I paced around nervously, walking from room to room like a caged lion. My stomach was churning. My throat felt so tight I could barely swallow. This is crazy, I thought. Crazy! Mr. Northwood probably won't even be home. I gazed out the kitchen window. No sign of him. The woodpile stood darkly in the center of the gray yard, like a hulking animal. A scrawny squirrel stood tensely to the left of it, its tail straight up in the air. A loud bang, a car backfiring, I think, made the squirrel dash frantically for safety. My stomach started to ache. I felt really sick. I began pacing again. One room blurred darkly into the next. Without realizing where I was going or what I was doing, I found myself in the basement. I was reaching behind the dryer, pulling out the loose stone in the wall, checking once again the place I was going to hide the gun after I had used it. Saturday afternoon. It was Saturday afternoon. Saturday, Saturday, Saturday. I repeated the word over and over until it had no meaning, until it had no sense, until nothing made sense. And then, back up in the kitchen, leaning on the windowsill, I saw Mr. Northwood appear in his backyard. His red and black wool coat was open, revealing a green turtleneck underneath. His gray hair stood up on his head, fluttering in the strong breeze. He carried an open can of paint in one hand, a fat paintbrush in the other. My heart pounding, I watched him make his way to the shed behind his garage, his head bobbing as he took his usual long strides. He's going to paint the shed, I realized, pressing my hot forehead against the cool window pane. He's going to paint the shed in his backyard, and I'm going to shoot him, because it's Saturday, 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 and nothing makes sense. My stomach churned. I pictured waves of molten lava rolling around inside me. I'm a volcano, I thought, about to erupt. I swallowed hard, trying to force back my nausea. I was in the living room now. I glanced down and saw the pistol gripped in my hand. How did it get there? I didn't remember walking from the kitchen. I didn't remember crossing the living room, opening the table drawer, lifting the gun. But I had. I had the pistol in my hand now, because it was Saturday, 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 and Mr. Northwood was in his backyard, waiting to be killed. Holding the pistol in one hand, I rubbed my aching stomach with the other. Then I started to the closet to get my coat, and the doorbell rang. Chapter 26. Startled, I dropped the gun. It hit the carpet and bounced toward the couch. The doorbell rang again. The sound sent a chill down my back. With a low groan, I bent and grabbed the gun. I stuffed it back into the drawer, pushed the drawer shut, and hurried to see who was at the front door. "Dennis!" He didn't smile. His eyes burned into mine. "Did you do it?" "Not yet," I said. I stepped back so he could get into the house. I'm not sure I can," I admitted. He didn't seem to hear me. "Is Northwood home?" I nodded. "In the backyard, painting his shed. Do you believe it? He picks the coldest day of the year to paint." "That's great," Dennis exclaimed, his eyes studying me. "What are you doing here?" I demanded. "You're not very friendly," he replied, pretending to pout. "I'm a little nervous," I told him, "and my stomach—" He interrupted me by moving forward and pressing his lips against mine. His face was cold from the outside, but his mouth was warm. "That was for moral support," he said when the kiss had ended. I trembled. My entire body was shaking. I felt as if I were made of rubber, as if I had no bones at all. "Let's get it over with," Dennis whispered in my ear, "so we can celebrate." "Celebrate," I repeated numbly. That word didn't make any sense either. Nothing made sense. Nothing. "Where's the gun?" Dennis demanded, staring intensely into my eyes. I pointed to the drawer in the green table. My stomach churned. "I'll be right back," I told him, rubbing it with one hand over my gray sweatsuit. "Where are you going?" he asked shrilly. I could see that he was nervous too. Beads of perspiration formed a glistening line across his forehead. "Just upstairs. I need to get some medicine. For my stomach. You know, the pink stuff." I hurried up the stairs, feeling dizzy and about to puke. I dived into the bathroom and slammed the door shut. I splashed cold water on my face and forced my breathing to slow down. Then I took a long swig of the pink stuff. I don't know how long I stood there, leaning over the sink, staring at my pale, frightened face in a medicine chest mirror, waiting for my stomach to stop churning and aching. I heard another car backfire somewhere outside. I heard the wind rattle our old bathroom window. I splashed more cold water on my hot face. I wanted to stay up there. I didn't want to go back down, but I knew I had to, because it was Saturday, 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 and I had accepted a dare, and you can't wimp out on a dare. I made my way downstairs on rubbery legs. My stomach still ached, but I forced myself to ignore it. "You okay?" Dennis demanded, eyeing me with concern. His entire forehead glistened with sweat now, and he had bright beads of sweat over his upper lip. He looks as pale as I do, I realized. He seems just as tense and afraid. That's so sweet, I thought. He cares about me. Dennis really cares about me. Somehow, his being nervous for me gave me new strength. I crossed the living room and pulled the pistol from the drawer. Again it felt so warm wrapped inside my cold, wet hand. "Good luck, Joanna," Dennis whispered. I felt his warm breath on my ear. I hesitated at the kitchen door. I wanted to kiss him. I wanted to kiss him for a long, long time. There will be time for that. After. That's what I told myself as I stepped outside. It was so gray, so dark. The sky seemed to hover right over my head. The air was cold but dry. Standing on the back stoop, the pistol gripped tightly in my hand inside my coat pocket, I raised my eyes to Mr. Northwood's backyard. I looked for him first at the shed, but to my surprise, he had moved to the woodpile. He seemed to be leaning over a stack of logs, rearranging them, I guessed. I sucked in a deep breath and began moving quickly, silently across the grass. The pistol was burning hot in my hand. The dark sky appeared to whir by overhead. The ground rolled beneath my sneakers. The grass appeared to buckle and bend. The tree trunks shimmied as if made of rubber. Everything moved. Everything roared past me, The ground, the sky, the bare trees, the wind. I shut my eyes, blinked several times, opened them again, trying to force the world to return to normal. Normal? This was Saturday, not a normal day, a day when nothing made sense. Mr. Northwood leaned over the pile of logs. His arms were outstretched. The back of his coat glared at me like a target. I pulled the pistol from my pocket. I clicked back the hammer. I slipped my finger over the trigger. I stepped closer. Closer. Could I do it? Could I? Chapter 27. I tried to aim for the middle of Mr. Northwood's back, but the gun began to shake in my hand. I gripped it with both hands, trying to hold it steady. Mr. Northwood's wool coat flapped behind him in a sudden gust of wind. I knew I had to shoot. Now, before he climbed up, before he turned around, before he saw me. I struggled to steady the gun. Shoot it, I ordered myself. Shoot! 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 I had to shoot, because it was Saturday. But I couldn't shoot. I knew I couldn't shoot. Everything started to make sense again. I couldn't do this, I knew. I'm me. I'm Joanna. I'm not a murderer. I can't shoot someone. I can't shoot anyone. I'm Joanna, and everything is starting to make sense. What was I thinking of? I asked myself. What happened to me? I lowered the gun. I moved it behind my back. I began to feel better immediately. My stomach stopped churning. My throat loosened. I began to breathe normally again. I'm not a murderer. I'm me. I'm Joanna. I'm not going to do it. Not. It's Saturday, but I'm not going to kill him. Mr. Northwood didn't move. Everything made sense again, except Mr. Northwood didn't move. The wind gusted. His red and black coat flapped. He didn't move. His arms hung limply over the stack of logs. Mr. Northwood? I slipped the gun into my coat pocket. Mr. Northwood? My voice, weak and trembling, blew back at me in the gusting wind. He didn't move. I stepped closer. Closer. I gasped when I saw the dark stain on the back of his coat. The dark purple stain. The dark purple blood stain. Mr. Northwood? Why didn't he answer me? Why didn't he move? I stared at the round purple stain on the coat. As it came into focus, I saw that the stain surrounded a deep hole, a hole through the coat, a hole in Mr. Northwood's back. Then I lowered my eyes to the dark puddle of blood on the ground in front of the woodpile. Mr. Northwood? Mr. Northwood? But of course he didn't answer me. As I stared in open-mouthed horror, I realized that he had already been shot to death. Chapter 28. My knees started to shake. I fought to stay on my feet. The gray sky seemed to lower over me, forcing me to see everything through a thick, swirling cloud. Suddenly, I became aware of footsteps behind me. I turned my head to see Dennis running across the grass, a smile on his face. "Joanna, you did it," he exclaimed. No, I choked out. "No, Dennis." He stepped beside me and slid his arm heavily around my trembling shoulders. His eyes were locked on Mr. Northwood's body, sprawled face down over the woodpile. "You did it," Dennis repeated happily. "I can't believe it. Wow, you did it." "But I didn't shoot him," I screamed, pulling out from under Dennis's arm. "Listen to me, Dennis. I didn't do it. I didn't." Dennis's grin didn't fade. His green eyes flashed excitedly as he turned to me. "Of course you did, Joanna. You shot him." "No, please, listen to me," I begged. "Check your gun," Dennis instructed calmly. "Go ahead, Joanna. Check it out." "Huh? What do you mean?" I hesitated, staring at him through the thick gray mist that refused to lift from my eyes. "What do you mean, Dennis? Why won't you listen to me?" "Check out your gun." He pointed to my coat pocket. I pulled the pistol out, the pistol I had never fired. Why was Dennis insisting that I had? "Look at it," Dennis instructed me, still grinning. "Your gun has been fired. See the powder on the barrel? Go ahead. Smell it." I obediently sniffed the nose of the barrel. I smelled gunpowder. The gun, I remembered, had felt so warm when I had lifted it from the drawer in the living room. "But Dennis, I didn't—" "I called the police," Dennis interrupted, his smile fading, his expression turning cold. "What?" I cried, startled. "I called the police," he replied casually. "They'll be here any second. I'll tell them it was self-defense, Joanna. Don't worry. I'll tell them that Northwood attacked you and you fired in self-defense." "But, Dennis, why?" I started to say, and then I stopped. It was all making sense. Even through the thick gray cloud that had lowered over me, it was all making sense. The car backfired while I was upstairs in the bathroom. It wasn't a backfire. "Dennis, you shot him," I cried in a hushed, shocked voice I'd never heard before. "You shot him, Dennis." Dennis took a step back, his eyes on Mr. Northwood's body. I'll tell them you did it in self-defense, Joanna, he said softly. But you shot him, I shouted, while I was in the bathroom. I could feel my fury grow. The volcano was about to erupt. I grabbed his shoulders. Dennis, why? He jerked away from me, his eyes lighting up angrily. Why, Dennis? I demanded. You set this all up, didn't you? I accused him. You set me up. Why? What's happening? A girl's voice called from the driveway. I turned to see Caitlin hurrying over to us. Oh, Caitlin, I cried, so happy to see her. Caitlin, help me, please? I went running to her, but she sidestepped me and hurried over to Dennis. It went perfectly, Dennis told her, grinning. He pointed down to Mr. Northwood's body. She kissed him on the cheek. We did it, Caitlin cried. Chapter 29. I froze. Caitlin slid her arm around Dennis's waist, holding him close. The trees along the back fence suddenly came to life, their branches trembling, their slender trunks leaning in a strong burst of wind. Fat brown leaves raced over my sneakers as if trying to flee. I don't get this, I muttered. It was all a dare, Dennis explained casually. Caitlin dared me to let you take care of our Northwood problem. You mean? Too many thoughts ran through my mind at once. I felt as if my head would burst. It was easy to get you to volunteer, Dennis continued. You seemed so eager, and you made it so easy, too. Caitlin nodded in agreement, her eyes on Dennis. I could hardly believe it when it turned out that you, of all people, owned a gun, he said with a laugh. I didn't even have to try to think of a clever way to kill him. You had the perfect weapon right in your own house. You went out with me just because you wanted me to kill Mr. Northwood? I demanded, ignoring the chills that ran down my back, ignoring the blood throbbing at my temples. Dennis nodded. Pretty much. It was a dare, see? Dennis is going with me? Caitlin murmured, staring hard at me. Didn't you wonder why he was suddenly so interested in you? I can't believe you planned this whole thing, I said, shaking my head unhappily. I have to get back on the track team, Dennis replied softly. Northwood was ruining my whole life. You seemed so eager to take care of Northwood for me. I let out a gasp. But then you shot him. You killed him. Why? I thought you might wimp out, Dennis replied. I couldn't take that chance, so I did it. But the police will think you did it. Everyone will think you did it. Something inside me exploded. The volcano went off. My anger, my hurt, burst out of me in a flood of cries and furious words. I trusted you. I trusted you. I cared about you. I heard the words escape my lips, but I didn't feel that I was saying them. I was too hurt, too broken to think clearly, too angry, too betrayed to see. Caitlin and Dennis held on to each other. They stared back at me defiantly, coldly. My anger and hurt meant nothing to them. Nothing. Dennis had killed Mr. Northwood, and now I was going to be blamed. My life was ruined so that Dennis could rejoin the track team and live happily ever after with Caitlin. I heard sirens approaching from the street. They blended with my own furious screams. I was out of control, out of myself, out of my head. I can't let you do this to me, I shrieked at Dennis. The pistol was in my hand. I raised it to Dennis's chest and pulled the trigger. Chapter 30. No, I didn't. I couldn't. I'm not a killer. I was breathing hard, gasping for air. I felt as if I were choking, drowning, going under, down, down into frightening darkness. What was that angry wail? Was it my desperate cry? Was it the police siren? Why was it so dark, so terrifyingly dark? Why couldn't I breathe? Drop the gun! Drop it! A man's stern voice broke through the darkness. Before I could move, powerful hands grabbed me roughly. I saw a flurry of movement, dark uniforms, grim faces. A hand pulled the pistol away by the barrel. Don't move, the man ordered. Someone stepped behind me, grabbed my arms, and forced them behind my back. The darkness lifted slowly. 4 police officers came into focus. 2 of them bent over Mr. Northwood. One of them held on to me tightly from behind. The other stepped up to Dennis and Caitlin. To my surprise, I saw that Caitlin had started to cry. It was so horrible, she wailed to the solemn-faced officer. We saw the whole thing, Dennis said, his features tight with sorrow, his arms still around Caitlin's trembling shoulders. Caitlin let out a sob. She took several deep breaths. We tried to stop Joanna, she told the police officer, wiping her tears off her cheeks with her hands. We tried to stop her, but we weren't in time. If only we'd arrived sooner, Dennis added, shaking his head. Just a few seconds earlier, and Mr. Northwood would still be alive. But she shot him, Caitlin cried. Joanna shot him? The other officer pulled my arms up behind me until I cried out from the pain. Read Joanna her rights, he instructed his partner. He lowered his face close to mine. The charge will be first-degree murder. Chapter 31. Hey, he's still alive. One of the officers bent over Mr. Northwood declared. Get an ambulance unit, his partner instructed. He's lost a lot of blood, but he's hanging on. He can make it if they hurry. Mr. Northwood wasn't dead. The good news made my heart jump as the officer droned on, reciting my rights. My mother, I murmured, struggling to think clearly. My mother is at work. We'll get your mother, the officer holding my arm said in a low, gruff voice. And you'll need a good attorney, miss. Even if the guy lives, you're in a lot of serious trouble. Assault with a deadly weapon, intent to kill. But I didn't. I choked off my words with a defeated sob. There was no way they would believe me. Caitlin and Dennis had seen to that. I could deny my guilt forever, but no one would ever listen. The whole school knew I was going to shoot Mr. Northwood. There were 100 witnesses who could tell the police about the bets on whether or not I would do it. Besides, the police didn't even need other witnesses. They had caught me with the gun that had shot Mr. Northwood. No one would believe I was innocent. No one. The officer started to drag me to the police cruisers. I glanced back to see Caitlin crying her eyes out. Why did she shoot him? Why? I heard Caitlin mumble through her tears. Quite a performance. The officer had pulled me to the driveway when we heard the other policeman's surprised cry. Hey, Walt, come back here. Take a look at this. He turned me roughly around and pulled me back toward the woodpile. Dennis was still comforting Caitlin. 2 officers were staring at something in their partner's hand. I pulled this from the victim's coat pocket, the officer said. He held up Mr. Northwood's tiny cassette recorder. So what? Another officer demanded. It's on. It's recording, his partner replied. I'll bet we have the whole shooting on tape here. Caitlin abruptly stopped crying. She and Dennis stared in silent horror as the policeman pushed a button and started to rewind the cassette in the tiny recorder. I don't believe this, one of the officers exclaimed. We heard jabbering backward voices at high speed. Then the officer pushed another button, and we heard Dennis say, It was all a dare. Caitlin dared me to let you take care of our Northwood problem. No one moved. No one breathed. Turn it off, Caitlin shrieked. She made a grab for the tape player, but an officer pulled her back by the waist. Dennis let out a defeated sigh and lowered his head. Caitlin struggled to get to the recorder, but the officer held on firmly. You shot him, I heard myself say, through the tiny tape player speaker. You killed him. Why? And then we all listened to Dennis's confession. I thought you might wimp out. I couldn't take that chance, so I did it. But the police will think you did it. Everyone will think you did it. An officer moved to grab Dennis, but Dennis made no attempts to run. He stood with his head bowed, his black hair falling down over his face. The charge will be assault with intent to kill, an officer was saying. Caitlin was crying for real now. A policeman recited her rights to her in a low monotone. I heard a loud siren out front. I knew it was the ambulance for Mr. Northwood. The officer let go of my arms. He apologized. We'll need your statement, but you can give it later, he said softly. He gestured to Dennis and Caitlin and frowned. Some friends you got, he said sarcastically. I never heard of anything like this. What was that he was saying on the tape about a dare? I watched the officers guide Dennis and Caitlin to the police cruisers. Caitlin was sobbing loudly. Dennis walked with his head bowed. The dare? It was all just a fantasy, I told him. Just a crazy fantasy that got too real. I turned away from the flashing red lights and hurried to my house. This has been a Nightfall Audiobooks production of The Dare by R.L. Stine, a Fear Street novel, Book 21. Hi, this is Chris again with Nightfall Audiobooks, and thank you for joining me for my production of The Dare by R.L. Stine from the Fear Street series. Holy cow. What is all this about? So some rich kids have a bad teacher that gives them all a hard time because they're rich, so they think that they can just buy their way into whatever result they want to get, and he declines. He's the only teacher who's given them any kind of pushback or resistance. So Dennis goes ballistic and threatens him because he's going to go to the Bahamas, and he just has to go to the Bahamas, and he can't fathom that Northwood wouldn't give him a break. So they developed this elaborate plot to have someone kill Northwood and then frame someone else for it. That's ridiculous. And poor Joanna, she didn't see that Dennis was only dating her just to have her be the scapegoat. The poor girl. That's insane. He was preying on her emotions really, really hard. What a shame. I like how the study date went wrong, and the kids found Joanna's father's gun, and they accidentally shot one of them, and then they tried to frame Northwood for it by putting the shot kid on his driveway, and then putting the gun on his front step, and then when Northwood comes out, he's like, oh my god, what's going on? And why is there a bleeding teen in my driveway? And Dennis points at him in front of the police and goes, oh my god, Northwood shot my friend. Dude, seriously? And then they're going to use the same gun again to try to kill somebody? This is the 80s, dude. They had ballistics back then. What a moron. Dennis is an idiot. It's unfortunate what he put Joanna through, but it's a life lesson she will never forget. This book was suggested by you, my listeners, and thank you very much for the suggestion. It was fun to read. It was very, very short. I read this to you from a text file, so I was constantly changing little idiosyncrasies like little typos and formatting problems and things. So every time I sat down to record, the book got shorter to read because I kept on editing out all this dumb stuff like empty space and things. So that was fun to do. It's like a mini game. So what should I do next? I don't know. Please give me a suggestion. Write me an email at nightfallaudiobooks@gmail.com. I'm also on YouTube at Nightfall Audiobooks, and I have a Patreon page, patreon.com/nightfallaudiobooks. Any help would be greatly appreciated. So tell your friends, tell your mom, tell whoever you think would like to listen to me tell them tales from R.L. Stine. Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you next time.